Hey, this is Gage Heskett. This is my discussion 8 over the Beats Poetry School and the New York Poetry School, Modern American Literature, Professor McMahon. So, kind of an overview of the Beats School. According to poets.org, this movement can be best described as a group of writers interested in changing consciousness and defying conventional writing. So, basically, they're wanting to change the perception of what people have when they read poems. They wanted to, like it says, just defy what people used to see when they see poems. They wanted to change their idea of thinking. So the movement began in the late 1940s, but was most prominent in San Francisco. In the 1950s, that's where it, the place where it grew. Obviously, the most, and when people think of it, they think of San Francisco usually. So many of these ideas contributed to the hippie era in the late 1960s, like with Woodstock and with the Vietnam War going on, that hippie movement. A lot of the ideas in the Beat School kind of contributed to what we know that era as today. So some of the main influences some of the influences on the Beat School of poetry is romantic period poets such as Shelley and Blake, jazz music, and surrealist poetry. And I'll talk about what it relates to surrealist poetry here in a second. And then literary characteristics and themes, formless and uses everyday language, so it's kind of just sporadic. It uses everyday language like me and you would use talking in just a normal conversation. Experimentation of drugs was one of the main themes. Like I said, with Woodstock in the late 60s, drugs were really just the sale of drugs and the use of drugs was at all-time high. It was just an explosion of drugs like acid, LSD, and stuff that they talked about in that video. And then sexuality. So I picked Howl by Allen Ginsberg. I think it is one of the most important poems when people think of Beat School poems. And some of the key themes in this are freedom of expression, drugs, and sexuality. My first quote I picked was when Ginsberg writes, "Who poverty and tatters and hollowed-eyed and high setup smoking, contemplating jazz." It's lines 7 through 9 in the textbook. So here we see, obviously, high setup smoking. We see the use of drugs in this line here. And Ginsberg uses the same because obviously, like I said, drugs were very popular. That's what everyone was doing. So he incorporated that in this poem. And we also see that connects to jazz music. He incorporated, the idea of jazz music and that all over the place, idea in this poem. So the second one I chose was "Who sweeten the snatches of a million girls trembling in the sunset and were red-eyed in the morning, but prepared to yada, yada, yada. Flashing buttocks under barns and naked in the lake, who went out whoring through Colorado in myriad stolen night cars." So obviously I just put stanza 40 because it's, several lines there, but he's just basically elaborating on the many sexual encounters he's had with, the barns, the lake, and whoring through Colorado and all that stuff. He's explaining all the women he's been with and what they've done or what he's done with them. This exhibits a theme of sexuality and shows a sense of surrealist, and why that is because in surrealist, he's documenting these sexual themes and defying conventional writing. That was one of the main ideas in surrealists. They put things in poems that no other poet would originally, with like Whitman and stuff like that. Like no one would openly share about that stuff. So that's kind of how I relate it back to that. So the New York School, an overview. I used Oxford Research Encyclopedia's definition. They're drawn to minimalist forms and sought to capture life as it happens, including coincidences and random events. So they're just incorporating, walking down the street and you see, someone, down the street. Like it's just kind of like as it's going on, it's like you're seeing what the characters sing. So the main location where this movement originated was in Manhattan in the 1950s and 60s, and the name originates from their aesthetic writing style. So the aesthetic of urbanization and like capitalism, like that big city type feel is what they're kind of going for there. The leaders of this movement include Barbara Guest, James Schuller, sorry if I said that wrong, and then Ted Berrigan were just some of the key leaders. And some of them, and probably the biggest influences were abstract artists. Just to name a few: Jackson Pollock, Lee Krasner, Elaine de Kooning. Like I said, sorry if I mispronounced that, but so they were just really attracted to this idea of abstract and just authenticity. And literary characteristics and themes of New York School include, like I said, it was very, their poetry was urbanized. Like I said, it's New York School. That's kind of why they chose that name for the movement. They're expressive. They clearly show what the character's feeling and, their emotion. And then they allowed everyday moments, pop culture, music, art, that kind of stuff into the work. So the one I picked, I know it's a lot. I won't spend too long on it, but The Day the Lady Died by Frank O'Hara is what I chose. And the critical themes I saw in this one was mortality, memory, and modern life or urban lifestyle, just to relate it back to that. And so in the very first three lines, it is 12:20 in New York on a Friday, 3 days after Bastille Day. Yes, it is 1959, and I go get a shoe shine. So here we see, she's having a memory of, the day Lady died. It's pretty straightforward. She's reflecting back on the day that she's talking about here in the story. Like I said, shows the theme of memory. The time frame of this piece goes back and forth a lot as you read it. You go from past to present to future, back to present, whatever. It just goes all over the place. And I think they kind of did that because of the abstractness their artists, their influences had, that abstractness, kind of random all over the place. I think that's kind of why he chose to do that. And then this quote connects back to the idea that New York School focuses on everyday events as they happen. And O'Hara utilizes that idea in the stanzas to follow. She's talked about, walking down the street and seeing, signs and stuff. Like, it just kind of depicts what she's doing and what she sees, or what he sees. And then O'Hara writes, and in the Golden Griffin, I get a little Verlaine for Patsy with drawings by Barnard, although I do think of Hesiod Trans, Richmond Lattimore, or Brendan Behan's new play, or Le Balconer, Les Negres of Jeannette. But I don't, I stick with Verlaine after practically going to sleep with Quandriness. And I know you think it kind of sounds confusing, but she's basically just talking about modern art and what she thinks of it, and just what's new and stuff. So this is kind of an idea how, she's really knowledgeable about art and cultural life. So this is kind of an example of how New York style poets incorporate art and pop culture, in this case, like French art, French culture, into their writings. And then the third one I chose is, I'm sweating a lot by now and thinking of leaning on the John Doerr in the 5 spot while she whispers a song on the keyboard to Mal Waldron, and everyone and I stopped breathing. So I think, as the title says, The Day the Lady Died, one of the main ideas of this poem is mortality, death, life, that kind of stuff. And then, like I said, concerning the death of someone called Lady, who was actually Billie Holiday, who was one of O'Hara's influences, or confidant, I guess you could say. And then we can infer from this quote that O'Hara is talking about death and mortality here when she stops breathing. I think he, or I meant to put he stops breathing, but he's kind of relating that to Lady, who's dying, to him in a way. So I think it's talking about death and mortality there. This example of how O'Hara talks about theme of mortality, like I said. And then the comparison of the two schools. Both schools have one main goal, I think, is that's to define what poetry used to be and to go against the norms of society. Because obviously, when we see the amount of drugs, sexual content, etc., in the Beat School poems, it's evident that no other poet before them would talk so openly about that. They wouldn't go into such depth about it because they thought it'd be too out there, too inappropriate, what have you. And then New York School, we see informal and abstract occurrences of everyday life in poems. So, like I said, kind of just stuff as they happen, kind of all over the place. Spontaneous would be a word, I guess, when we talk about New York School. And then most poems in the past didn't really explain in detail what they were doing at the exact moment, like in such detail that The Day That Lady Died did. New York School is known for this a lot in a lot of their poems. And then one important difference is that while beat poets associated with hippies and rebellious people, drugs, alcohol, all that, the New York School was associated with more, I guess, culture, you could say, art, pop culture, main events, news, like that kind of crowd. So I think that's one big difference. And then my reflection question, do you think that some of the poets in the beat era were too vulgar and inappropriate, or do you think that it was necessary for them to put that stuff to get the point across, and then explain your reason why I think so? So that's it for my discussion, and thanks for listening.